"I'm 45 and I've never lived," David whispered, as he watched his 82-year-old mother sleep in her wheelchair at the Las Vegas International Hotel lobby. For 23 years he had devoted his entire existence to caring for her, turning down promotions, relationships, and dreams to ensure she was never alone. When Elvis noticed the middle-aged man gently adjusting his mother's blanket with the tenderness of someone who had made caregiving his life's purpose, he saw something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, sacrifice, and what it truly means to honor your parents. But to understand why this moment would transform both David's understanding of devotion and Elvis's perspective on family loyalty, you need to know about the choice David made 23 years ago that would define the rest of his life. Because this story begins not with tragedy or obligation, but with a young man's promise that he never intended to keep for so long. It was March 18, 1975, at the Las Vegas International Hotel, and 45-year-old David Patterson was experiencing what should have been a celebration. His mother, Eleanor Patterson, was celebrating her 82nd birthday, and despite her advancing dementia, she had insisted on spending it at her favorite place, watching Elvis perform in the city she had fallen in love with during her honeymoon 40 years earlier. David sat beside his mother's wheelchair in the hotel lobby, watching her face light up with the few moments of clarity she still experienced when surrounded by the music and glamour that had once filled her with such joy. These brief glimpses of the vibrant woman she used to be were becoming increasingly rare, and David treasured each one like precious gems in an otherwise difficult journey. Eleanor Patterson had been a remarkable woman in her prime. A former schoolteacher with a passion for literature and music, she had raised David as a single mother after his father died in a car accident when David was just 12 years old. She had worked 2 jobs to put him through college, sacrificing her own dreams to ensure he could pursue his education and build a successful career. David had graduated from college with a degree in engineering and landed a promising job with a major construction company. At 22, his future looked bright with possibilities. A growing career, a serious girlfriend named Linda, whom he planned to marry, and dreams of starting his own family while building a comfortable life for himself and his mother. But life has a way of changing course when you least expect it. When David was 22 and Eleanor was 59, she began showing the first signs of what would eventually be diagnosed as early-onset dementia. At first, it was just small things, forgetting appointments, misplacing keys, occasionally struggling to find the right word in conversation. David initially attributed these lapses to stress from her demanding job and the natural effects of aging. But as the symptoms became more frequent and concerning, he convinced her to see a doctor. The diagnosis came like a thunderbolt: early-stage Alzheimer's disease, with a prognosis that would require increasing levels of care and supervision as the condition progressed. The doctor's words still echoed in David's memory: "She'll need someone she trusts to help her maintain her independence for as long as possible. As the disease progresses, she'll require full-time care. You should start thinking about long-term arrangements now, while she can still participate in those decisions." David had faced a choice that no young man should have to make. He could pursue his own life, marry Linda, advance his career, start his own family, while arranging professional care for his mother. Or he could put his personal plans on hold and dedicate himself to being her primary caregiver, ensuring she received the love and attention she had always given him. Linda had been understanding at first, expecting that they would find a way to balance David's responsibilities to his mother with their own relationship and future plans. "We can make this work," she had said. "We'll find her a good facility nearby, visit regularly, and still build our life together." But David couldn't bring himself to place his mother in institutional care. Eleanor had sacrificed everything for him, working double shifts and foregoing her own dreams to give him opportunities she never had. The thought of her spending her final years among strangers, confused and frightened by her deteriorating condition, was unbearable to him. So David made what he thought would be a temporary decision. He would care for his mother himself, at least in the early stages of her illness, while continuing to work and maintain his relationship with Linda. He assumed that this arrangement would last perhaps a few years at most, after which he could reassess the situation and make different choices. 23 years later, David was still making the same choice every single day. The progression of Eleanor's condition had been slower than initially predicted, which in many ways made David's sacrifice both easier and more difficult. She retained enough of her personality and independence to make caring for her feel less like a burden and more like an extension of their natural relationship. But the gradual nature of her decline also meant that there was never a clear moment when David felt he could step back and reclaim his own life. Over the years, David had turned down 3 major promotions that would have required relocation or extensive travel. He had ended his engagement to Linda when it became clear that his caregiving responsibilities were incompatible with the kind of marriage and family life she wanted. He had watched friends build careers, get married, have children, and create the kind of adult life he had once envisioned for himself, while he remained in a holding pattern defined by his mother's needs. The sacrifice had been gradual and largely invisible to the outside world. David continued working, maintained friendships, and participated in social activities when his mother's condition allowed. But every major life decision was filtered through the question of how it would affect his ability to care for Eleanor, and increasingly, the answer was that any significant change in his life was simply impossible. Now, at 45, David found himself confronting the reality that he had essentially skipped the traditional milestones of middle-aged life. He had never married, never had children, never owned a home of his own, never traveled beyond the radius required for his mother's medical appointments and occasional outings like this birthday celebration. The hotel lobby where they sat was filled with people living lives that seemed exotic to David: couples on romantic getaways, families celebrating special occasions, groups of friends enjoying freedom and spontaneity that felt like luxuries from another world. David watched them with a mixture of wistfulness and acceptance, wondering sometimes what his life might have been like if he had made different choices. Eleanor stirred in her wheelchair, her eyes opening with the confusion that had become typical of her waking moments. "Where are we, dear?" she asked, using the generic endearment she employed when she couldn't remember someone's name but sensed they were important to her. "We're in Las Vegas, Mom," David said gently, taking her hand. "It's your birthday and we're going to see Elvis perform tonight, just like you wanted." Eleanor's face brightened with genuine pleasure, one of the increasingly rare moments when the mention of something she loved could cut through the fog of her condition. "Elvis, oh how wonderful. I've always loved his music. Do you know, I saw him perform once many years ago on my honeymoon." David had heard this story countless times, but he never tired of seeing the joy it brought to his mother's face. "Tell me about it," he said, settling back in his chair to listen to the familiar narrative that seemed to anchor Eleanor to her happier memories. "It was 1955, Eleanor began, her voice gaining strength as she accessed memories that remained vivid despite her current condition. "Your father and I had saved up for months to afford a weekend in Las Vegas for our honeymoon. We couldn't afford much, but we splurged on tickets to see this young singer everyone was talking about. Elvis Presley, can you imagine? He was just becoming famous, and we saw him in a small venue so close we could see the sweat on his forehead." David smiled, knowing what came next in the story but appreciating how the telling of it seemed to restore some of Eleanor's former animation and clarity. "He sang 'Love Me Tender' that night," Eleanor continued, "and your father took my hand and said, 'That's going to be our song, Ellie,' and it was, you know. We danced to it at every anniversary, and your father would sing it to me when I was feeling sad or worried about something." The story always ended the same way, with Eleanor's face clouding slightly as she tried to grasp memories that remained just out of reach. "I wish your father were here to see Elvis with us tonight," she said. "He would have loved this." David squeezed his mother's hand gently. "I'm sure he would have, Mom, but I'm here with you, and we're going to have a wonderful time." It was during this conversation that Elvis Presley, who had been sitting quietly in a corner of the lobby reviewing some paperwork before his evening performance, began paying attention to the interaction between David and Eleanor. Something about the gentle patience in David's voice and the obvious love and care he showed his mother caught Elvis's attention in a way that made him want to understand more about their story. Elvis had always been observant about the people around him, particularly those who seemed to be experiencing significant life moments in his presence. His own deep love for his mother Gladys had given him a special sensitivity to parent-child relationships, and he could recognize the signs of someone who had made caring for an aging parent their primary life purpose. What struck Elvis most was the complete absence of resentment or frustration in David's demeanor. Many people in similar situations, no matter how devoted they were to their parents, occasionally showed signs of the stress and sacrifice involved in full-time caregiving. But David seemed to have achieved a kind of peaceful acceptance that suggested either remarkable maturity or a level of self-sacrifice that bordered on the extraordinary. Elvis continued to observe as David helped Eleanor navigate her confusion about their surroundings, patiently answering the same questions multiple times and gently redirecting her attention when she became agitated about things she couldn't remember. The interaction had the quality of a well-rehearsed dance, suggesting that David had been managing these kinds of conversations for a very long time. When Eleanor dozed off again in her wheelchair, Elvis noticed David's expression change. For just a moment, when he thought no one was watching, David's face revealed the weight of his circumstances. It wasn't self-pity exactly, but rather a profound weariness that spoke to years of putting someone else's needs ahead of his own without complaint or recognition. Elvis made a decision that would surprise his handlers and security team. Instead of retreating to his dressing room to prepare for his performance, he approached David and Eleanor, drawn by an impulse to understand more about the sacrifice he had witnessed. "Excuse me," Elvis said quietly, not wanting to startle Eleanor awake. "I couldn't help overhearing that it's your mother's birthday. I'm Elvis Presley, and I wanted to wish her a happy birthday personally." David looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting this level of personal attention from the performer they had come to see. "Mr. Presley, this is such an honor. My mother is a huge fan of yours. She's been looking forward to your show for weeks." Elvis sat down in the chair across from them, his presence immediately drawing the attention of other hotel guests who recognized him but seemed to sense that this was a private moment not meant for interruption. "Tell me about your mother," Elvis said to David. "She seems like a special lady." David's face lit up with the kind of pride that comes from genuinely loving someone despite the challenges they might present. "She's the strongest person I've ever known. She raised me as a single mother after my father died, worked 2 jobs to put me through college, and never complained about the sacrifices she had to make. She's always been there for me, and now it's my turn to be there for her." Elvis nodded, understanding immediately the depth of loyalty and love that David's simple words represented. "How long have you been caring for her?" 23 years, David replied. "She was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's when I was 22. I've been her primary caregiver ever since." Elvis felt a deep respect for the man sitting across from him. 23 years of caregiving represented the entire span of what most people would consider their prime adult years. "That's a remarkable commitment," Elvis said. "You must have had to make some difficult choices along the way." David was quiet for a moment, perhaps surprised by the personal nature of the conversation. "I wouldn't call them difficult," he finally said. "My mother gave up everything for me when I was young. This is just my way of returning that love." But Elvis could see beyond David's diplomatic response to the reality of what such dedication had cost. "What about your own life? Your own dreams and plans?" David glanced at his sleeping mother, then back at Elvis. "This is my life. Taking care of her is the most important thing I can do with my time." Elvis appreciated David's loyalty, but he also recognized the subtle sadness that underlied his words. This was a man who had essentially paused his own life to care for someone else, and while his devotion was admirable, Elvis wondered if such complete self-sacrifice was healthy or sustainable. "Has she ever expressed what she wants for you?" Elvis asked gently. "What kind of life she hopes you'll have?" David considered this question carefully. "Before her condition became too advanced, she used to worry about me. She would say things like, 'David, you need to live your own lives, and I don't want to be the reason you never get married or have children.' But I could never take those concerns seriously. She needed me, and that was more important than anything else." Elvis felt his heart go out to both David and Eleanor. Here was a situation where love was so deep and genuine on both sides that it had created a kind of beautiful trap. David's devotion was preventing him from building the kind of independent adult life that Eleanor had probably wanted for him, while Eleanor's condition made it impossible for her to effectively advocate for her son's well-being. "Can I ask you something personal?" Elvis said. "Do you ever think about what your mother was like when she was your age? What she wanted from her life?" David smiled at the question. "She was incredible, full of energy and dreams. She wanted to travel, to write poetry, to maybe teach at a university level. She had so many plans before my father died, and she had to focus all her attention on raising me and keeping us financially stable. And do you think she would want you to spend your entire adult life in the same kind of sacrifice she experienced?" Elvis asked. The question clearly struck David deeply. He was quiet for several minutes, looking at his mother with an expression that suggested he was seeing her from a different perspective for the first time in years. "I never thought of it that way," David admitted. "I was so focused on repaying what she had done for me that I didn't consider whether continuing that pattern of sacrifice was really what she would want." Elvis leaned forward, speaking with the kind of gentle intensity that characterized his most meaningful conversations. "David, I can see how much you love your mother, and your dedication to her is one of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed. But I wonder if there's a way to honor that love while also honoring the dreams she had for you." Eleanor stirred in her wheelchair, her eyes opening with the brief clarity that sometimes accompanied her transitions between sleep and waking. "David," she said, her voice stronger and more focused than it had been earlier. "Is that you, dear?" "Yes, Mom. I'm right here," David said, taking her hand. Eleanor looked around the lobby, taking in her surroundings with unusual awareness. "We're in Las Vegas, aren't we? For my birthday?" "That's right," David confirmed, pleased by her moment of lucidity. Eleanor noticed Elvis sitting across from them and smiled with genuine recognition. "Mr. Presley, what a wonderful surprise. I've been a fan of yours since the 1950s. Elvis stood and took Eleanor's other hand gently. "Mrs. Patterson, your son has been telling me what a remarkable woman you are. Happy birthday." Eleanor beamed at the attention, and for a moment she seemed almost like her former self. "David is such a good boy," she said to Elvis. "He takes such wonderful care of me. But sometimes I worry that he's missing out on his own life because of me." Elvis and David exchanged a meaningful look. Even in her diminished state, Eleanor retained enough awareness to recognize the sacrifice her son was making for her. "What would you want for David if you could give him anything?" Elvis asked Eleanor. Eleanor's response was immediate and clear. "I want him to be happy. I want him to have a family of his own, to travel, to experience all the things I never got to do. I don't want my illness to prevent him from living fully." David felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to his mother express the concerns she had voiced years earlier, before her condition had made such conversations impossible. Elvis saw the emotion on David's face and recognized this as a pivotal moment. "Mrs. Patterson, what if I told you that there might be a way for David to have more of his own life while still ensuring that you receive the best possible care?" Eleanor looked at Elvis with interest, her moment of clarity holding strong. "What do you mean?" Elvis had been formulating an idea throughout their conversation, inspired by his own experiences with caring for aging parents and his understanding of the resources available to families facing similar challenges. "I know about some very special programs," Elvis said, "where people like you can receive excellent professional care in a comfortable home-like environment while still maintaining close relationships with their families. David could still be a central part of your life while also having the freedom to pursue his own dreams and relationships." David looked skeptical. "Mr. Presley, I appreciate what you're saying, but I've looked into care facilities before. They're either too expensive or too impersonal, and I can't bear the thought of my mother feeling abandoned or confused in an unfamiliar place." Elvis smiled. "What if I told you about a place that's different? A program that's designed specifically for people like your mother, run by people who understand that caring for someone with dementia requires both professional expertise and genuine love. Eleanor squeezed David's hand. "I think we should listen to what Mr. Presley has to say," she said, with more clarity than she had shown in months. Elvis spent the next few minutes describing a specialized care community that he had helped fund, designed specifically for individuals with dementia and their families. The program focused on maintaining dignity, comfort, and family connections while providing the kind of professional medical care that individual family members couldn't realistically provide long-term. "The most important thing about this place," Elvis explained, "is that it's designed to support families, not replace them. David, you would still be your mother's primary advocate and the most important person in her life, but you would also have the support of trained professionals who could handle the day-to-day medical care, while you focused on the emotional connection that only a son can provide." David listened with growing interest, but also with the wariness of someone who had spent decades making his mother's care his sole responsibility. "I understand your concerns," Elvis continued. "You're worried that any change in your mother's care situation might make her feel abandoned or cause her condition to worsen. But what if the opposite were true? What if having professional support actually allowed you to be a better son by freeing you to focus on the parts of caregiving that only you can provide?" Eleanor, still experiencing her unusual period of clarity, spoke up again. "David, I want you to consider this. I've seen how tired you get, how much you worry about me. Maybe having some help would be good for both of us." Elvis could see David wrestling with 23 years of assumptions about his responsibilities and the fear of making any change that might negatively impact his mother's well-being. "Let me ask you this," Elvis said. "If your mother could have the same level of love and attention she receives now, plus professional medical care that could help her maintain her health and comfort better than you can provide alone, would you want that for her?" David nodded slowly. "Of course I would want what's best for her. And if you could still see her every day, still be the most important person in her life, still make all the major decisions about her care, but also have the freedom to build some aspects of your own life, do you think that might actually make you a better caregiver rather than a worse one?" This question struck at the heart of David's internal conflict. He had been operating under the assumption that any division of his attention would necessarily mean less love and care for his mother. But Elvis was suggesting that the opposite might be true, that having his own life might actually make him more present and engaged during the time he spent with Eleanor. "I don't know," David admitted. "I've been doing this for so long that I can't imagine doing it differently." Eleanor reached up and touched her son's face with surprising gentleness. "David, my love, I want you to try. For me. I want to know that when I'm gone you'll have a life to live, people who care about you, experiences that make you happy. That would be the greatest gift you could give me." Elvis watched this exchange with deep emotion, recognizing the profound love between mother and son that was finally finding a way to express itself in terms of mutual care rather than one-sided sacrifice. "There's something else I want to share with you both," Elvis said. "I've arranged for Linda to be here tonight. She's in the audience for my show, and she's been hoping for a chance to see you again, David." David looked shocked. "Linda? But why would she?" "I had my people track her down after our conversation," Elvis explained. "She never married David. She's been waiting, hoping that someday circumstances might change and you two might have another chance." David felt his world shifting in ways that seemed both terrifying and exhilarating. For 23 years he had lived with the certainty that his choices had closed certain doors forever. The possibility that some of those doors might still be open was overwhelming. Eleanor clapped her hands together with delight. "Linda. Oh David, I always hoped you two would find your way back to each other. She was such a lovely girl." "Mom," David said gently. "Linda and I broke up because I couldn't give her the kind of life she deserved. That hasn't changed." "But it could change," Elvis interjected. "If you were willing to accept help with your mother's care, if you were willing to trust that love doesn't always require complete self-sacrifice, maybe you could discover what kind of life you want to build for yourself." David looked back and forth between Elvis and his mother, feeling as though he was standing at a crossroads that he had never imagined could exist. "What if I'm not good at having my own life?" David asked. "What if I've been a caregiver for so long that I don't know how to be anything else?" Elvis smiled with understanding. "Then you'll learn, just like everyone else does. And you'll have your mother cheering you on every step of the way." Eleanor nodded enthusiastically. "I want to see you happy, David. I want to meet your children someday. I want to know that my love for you didn't trap you in a life that was too small for your heart." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elvis's manager, who reminded him that he needed to prepare for his evening performance. But before leaving, Elvis made one final offer that would change everything for David and Eleanor. "I want both of you to be my guests for dinner tomorrow night," Elvis said. "I'll have Linda there, and we can talk more about the care facility I mentioned. No pressure, no commitments, just a chance to explore some possibilities that might work for everyone." David looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "Okay," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll be there." Elvis shook David's hand and kissed Eleanor's cheek. "I have a feeling tomorrow is going to be the beginning of something wonderful for both of you." After Elvis left to prepare for his show, David and Eleanor sat in comfortable silence, both processing the unexpected turn their evening had taken. "Are you scared?" Eleanor asked her son. "Terrified," David admitted. "But also, hopeful, I think. For the first time in years I'm feeling hopeful." Eleanor smiled. "Good. Hope is what I've been praying for both of us." The evening's performance was magical in ways that neither David nor Eleanor had anticipated. Elvis dedicated several songs to the families who show us what love really looks like, and during Love Me Tender, he looked directly at David and Eleanor, acknowledging the journey they were beginning together. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Elvis invited David and Eleanor backstage after the show, where Linda was waiting with tears in her eyes and 23 years of patient love written on her face. The reunion between David and Linda was tentative at first, both of them aware of how much time had passed and how much their lives had been shaped by the choices they had made. But Eleanor, in one of her moments of perfect clarity, took Linda's hand and said, "I never stopped hoping you two would find your way back to each other." Over the following months, David gradually transitioned Eleanor into the specialized care facility that Elvis had recommended. The process was slower and more careful than anyone expected, but it proved to be everything Elvis had promised. Eleanor received excellent medical care while maintaining her connection to David, and David slowly began to reclaim aspects of his identity beyond caregiving. The relationship between David and Linda developed carefully, both of them aware that they were different people than they had been 23 years earlier. But the foundation of love that had existed between them proved strong enough to support the new life they began building together. Eleanor lived for 3 more years in the care facility, surrounded by professional support and family love. She was able to attend David and Linda's wedding, meet her first grandchild, and see her son discover the happiness she had always wanted for him. When Eleanor died peacefully at age 85, surrounded by people who loved her, David was able to grieve as a son rather than as a caregiver. The distinction proved more important than he had ever imagined. At Eleanor's funeral, Elvis spoke about the lesson she had taught him about the difference between love and sacrifice, and how sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing someone to live their own life fully. Eleanor Patterson showed us that true love doesn't trap people. Elvis said, "It sets them free to become the best version of themselves." She spent 23 years being loved completely by her son, and then she used that love to give him permission to live his own dreams. That's the kind of mother, and the kind of person, the world needs more of. David and Linda went on to have 2 children, and build the kind of life that David had thought was impossible for him. But perhaps more importantly, David learned to balance devotion with self-care, commitment with personal growth, and love with the freedom that allows love to flourish rather than suffocate. The care facility that Elvis helped fund became a model for similar programs across the country, proving that caring for aging parents doesn't have to mean sacrificing your own chance at happiness and fulfillment. Years later, When people asked David about those 23 years of caregiving, he never expressed regret. But he also never failed to mention that learning to accept help and live his own life had made him a better son, a better husband, a better father, and a better human being. "Taking care of my mother was the most important thing I ever did," David would say. "But learning when to share that responsibility with others who could help us both was the wisest thing I ever did." The story of David, Eleanor, and Elvis became a touchstone for families facing similar challenges, proving that love doesn't always require total self-sacrifice, and that sometimes the most profound act of devotion is helping someone you love learn to live fully, rather than simply exist in service to others. In a world where caregiving is often seen as an all-or-nothing proposition, their story offered hope that there could be another way. A way that honored both the needs of those requiring care and the dreams of those providing it, creating space for everyone to flourish within the circle of love that binds families together. The years that followed proved transformative for everyone involved in David and Eleanor's story. The care facility that Elvis had recommended became more than just a place where Eleanor received professional attention. It became a community where she formed new friendships, participated in activities that sparked her remaining cognitive abilities, and found purpose in mentoring younger staff members who were drawn to her gentle wisdom. Eleanor's presence at the facility had an unexpected impact on other residents and their families. Her story of encouraging her son to pursue his own life while still maintaining their close bond became legendary among families struggling with similar decisions. Social workers began referring to the Eleanor approach when counseling families about the balance between devotion and independence. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the facility's director, observed that Eleanor's attitude toward her son's newfound freedom had a profound effect on other residents who worried about being burdens to their own children. Eleanor would tell anyone who would listen that the greatest gift she could give David was her blessing to live fully. Dr. Mitchell recalled, "She turned the narrative from 'I'm taking away from my child's life' to 'I'm giving my child permission to flourish.'" David's transition back into independent living proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. After 23 years of having every decision filtered through his mother's needs, he found himself paralyzed by choices that other adults took for granted. Simple decisions like what to eat for dinner or how to spend a weekend required conscious effort and deliberation. Linda proved to be an invaluable partner in this process, understanding that David needed to rediscover his own preferences and interests gradually. She encouraged him to try activities he had never experienced, to form opinions about things that had never mattered when his focus was entirely on caregiving. Their first real date, after 23 years apart, took place at a cooking class, something David had never considered before, because his culinary efforts had been focused entirely on his mother's dietary restrictions and preferences. Learning to cook for pleasure rather than medical necessity became a metaphor for David's broader journey toward rediscovering what brought him joy. The process of planning their wedding revealed how profoundly David's years of caregiving had shaped his identity and decision-making processes. Every choice, from the venue to the guest list to the menu, required him to consider what he actually wanted rather than what would be most practical or least disruptive to someone else's care routine. Eleanor participated enthusiastically in the wedding planning from her facility, offering opinions and suggestions with a clarity and engagement that surprised everyone. The prospect of seeing her son married seemed to energize her in ways that her regular routine had not, demonstrating the power of anticipation and purpose in maintaining cognitive function. The wedding itself became a celebration not just of David and Linda's reunion, but of the possibility that love can take many forms, and that sacrifice doesn't always have to be permanent. Eleanor, wearing a dress that Linda had helped her choose, walked David down the aisle with the assistance of her walker, beaming with pride at the life her son was finally embracing. Elvis performed at the reception, singing "Love Me Tender" as David and Linda's first dance, the same song that Eleanor and her husband had danced to decades earlier. The circular nature of the moment, a love song connecting generations, dreams passed down and finally realized, moved everyone present to understand that some stories take decades to reach their true conclusions. The birth of David and Linda's first child, Eleanor Marie, named for her grandmother, brought a new dimension to Eleanor's experience at the care facility. Having a purpose that extended beyond her own daily routine seemed to slow the progression of her condition and brought moments of clarity that surprised her medical team. Eleanor would spend hours holding her granddaughter, singing the same lullabies she had sung to David decades earlier. The staff noticed that on days when Eleanor was expecting visits from the baby, she was more alert, more oriented, and more engaged with her surroundings. David's experience as a new father was complicated by his years of caregiving experience. While he was certainly prepared for the physical demands of caring for someone else, he had to learn to balance protection with encouragement, support with independence, lessons that his own experience as a caregiver had not necessarily taught him. Linda observed that David's instinct was to anticipate every need and prevent every potential problem, an approach that had served him well in caring for his mother, but was less appropriate for raising a child who needed to develop her own capabilities and resilience. The process of learning to be a father while continuing to be a devoted son created opportunities for David to understand the difference between healthy care and overprotective control. Eleanor, in her moments of clarity, proved to be an unexpected source of wisdom about finding this balance. "You took such good care of me," she told David during one of their visits, "but now you need to teach Eleanor Marie how to take care of herself. That's what parents do. We love our children enough to help them become independent." The second child, Thomas David, was born when Eleanor was 84 and her condition had progressed significantly. She was less able to engage with him directly, but her presence at family gatherings still provided continuity and connection to the family's history and values. David found that having children gave him a new perspective on his years of caring for his mother. He began to understand that his devotion had been valuable not just for Eleanor's well-being, but as preparation for the kind of patient, attentive parenting that his own children would benefit from. The balance between visiting his mother, raising his children, maintaining his marriage, and pursuing his career required skills that David had to develop consciously. Time management, priority setting, and boundary establishment became active practices rather than automatic responses. Linda's support proved crucial during this period, as she helped David navigate the guilt he sometimes felt about not being available to his mother as constantly as he had been before. She reminded him regularly that Eleanor's happiness in seeing him build his own life was more valuable than the comfort he might provide through constant presence. The care facility's approach to family involvement helped ease David's transition. Rather than replacing family connections, the professional staff enhanced them by handling medical and routine care needs, freeing family visits to focus on emotional connection and shared experiences. Eleanor's final year was marked by increasing confusion and physical frailty, but also by moments of profound peace and contentment that seemed connected to her satisfaction with David's life choices. She died quietly on a Tuesday afternoon, with David holding her hand and sharing stories about her grandchildren's latest accomplishments. At Eleanor's funeral, the gathering reflected the community she had built around her story. Care facility staff attended alongside David's family. Elvis sent flowers with a note acknowledging Eleanor's wisdom about love and sacrifice. And Linda spoke about the mother-in-law who had welcomed her back into the family with open arms after 23 years. David's eulogy focused not on Eleanor's illness or the care she required, but on the strength, wisdom, and generosity that had defined her character even in her most vulnerable years. He spoke about lessons she had taught him about the difference between helping and enabling, between love and possession, between care and control. The months following Eleanor's death were difficult for David in unexpected ways. The grief was profound but clean, the grief of loss rather than the complicated emotions that can accompany the death of someone whose care has defined your entire adult life. David found himself with time and energy that he hadn't experienced in decades. The freedom was initially disorienting, but gradually became an opportunity to discover interests and pursue goals that had been deferred for more than 20 years. He returned to school part-time to complete a master's degree in social work, inspired by his experience to help other families navigate the challenges of long-term caregiving. His thesis focused on models of care that support both patients and family caregivers in maintaining their individual identities while honoring their connections to each other. The career change allowed David to transform his caregiving experience into professional expertise, counseling families who were facing decisions similar to the ones he had confronted. His unique perspective, as someone who had chosen complete self-sacrifice and then learned to find balance, gave him credibility with clients who were struggling with guilt and fear about their own choices. Linda, who had become a nurse during the years she and David were apart, found that their shared experience in healthcare created a strong foundation for their marriage. They both understood the emotional demands of caring for others and the importance of maintaining their own well-being in order to serve effectively. The facility where Eleanor had lived became a regular part of David's professional life, as he consulted on family services and staff training programs. His story with Eleanor was used to train new staff members about the importance of supporting family relationships rather than replacing them. Elvis remained connected to the family through the years, occasionally visiting the care facility and always asking about David's progress in building his independent life. The friendship that had begun with a chance encounter in a hotel lobby developed into a lasting relationship based on shared values about family, love, and service to others. The care facility itself became a model for similar programs across the country, demonstrating that excellent professional care and strong family connections could coexist and strengthen each other. The Eleanor model was adopted by facilities nationwide, emphasizing the importance of helping families transition gradually and maintain meaningful relationships throughout the caregiving journey. Research conducted at the facility showed that residents whose families were supported in maintaining balanced relationships had better health outcomes, slower cognitive decline, and higher levels of satisfaction with their care. The data supported what Eleanor had intuitively understood, that helping her son live fully made him better able to love her completely. David's children grew up understanding their grandmother's story as one of wisdom and strength rather than tragedy or limitation. They learned about Eleanor's decision to encourage their father's independence as an act of profound love, and they carried those lessons into their own relationships and life choices. Thomas, who had never known Eleanor during her healthy years, developed a special connection to her story through family photographs and David's memories. He wrote school reports about his grandmother's influence on their family and spoke with pride about her role in bringing his parents together. Eleanor Marie, who had more direct memories of her grandmother, chose to pursue a career in geriatric nursing, inspired by the care Eleanor had received and the model of dignity and respect that the facility had provided. Her career choice represented a continuation of Eleanor's legacy in unexpected ways. The wedding anniversary tradition that David and Linda established included annual visits to Eleanor's grave, where they shared updates about their children, their work, and their continued growth as individuals and as a couple. These visits became opportunities to reflect on the lessons Eleanor had taught them about love that liberates rather than constrains. As David approached his 60th birthday, he reflected on the 15 years that had passed since Eleanor's death and the ways that her influence continued to shape his choices and priorities. The balance he had learned between caring for others and maintaining his own identity had become a defining characteristic of his approach to all relationships. The story of David, Eleanor, and Elvis continued to inspire other families facing similar challenges, proving that caregiving doesn't have to mean the end of personal growth and that love can take many forms while remaining genuine and transformative. Their experience offered hope to anyone struggling to balance devotion to others with respect for their own needs and dreams. In the end, Eleanor's greatest gift to David was not the love she showed him during his childhood, or even the care he provided during her illness, but the wisdom to understand that true love sometimes means encouraging the people we care about to live fully, even when that means living somewhat apart from us. Their story became a testament to the idea that family bonds can be strongest when they support individual flourishing rather than demanding total sacrifice, and that the most profound acts of love often involve helping others become the best versions of themselves rather than keeping them close at any cost. The legacy of David and Eleanor's journey extended far beyond their immediate family, influencing policy discussions about long-term care, family support services, and the integration of professional healthcare with family caregiving. Their experience demonstrated that the traditional binary choice between family care and institutional care was a false dichotomy, and that hybrid models could serve families more effectively. Healthcare professionals began incorporating their story into training programs for geriatric care specialists, social workers, and family counselors. The case study illustrated how supporting caregivers in maintaining their own identities and relationships could ultimately benefit the care recipients as well as the broader family system. Academic researchers studying caregiver burden and family dynamics used David's experience as an example of how prolonged caregiving without adequate support could lead to a phenomenon they termed caregiver identity fusion, where the individual's sense of self becomes so intertwined with their caregiving role that they lose connection to their own needs, interests, and potential for growth. The research showed that caregivers who maintained aspects of their independent identity were better able to provide emotional support to their care recipients over the long term, were less likely to experience burnout or resentment, and were more successful at transitioning to life after their caregiving responsibilities ended. Eleanor's approach to encouraging David's independence became a model for how care recipients could actively participate in supporting their caregivers' well-being. Support groups for people with dementia and other chronic conditions began incorporating discussions about how patients could advocate for their caregivers' needs, even when their own cognitive abilities were limited. The care facility where Eleanor lived implemented new programs based on lessons learned from her experience. Family education sessions helped relatives understand the difference between abandonment and appropriate support, and staff training emphasized the importance of facilitating rather than replacing family relationships. These programs became so successful that they were replicated in facilities across the country, fundamentally changing how professional care and family involvement were balanced in long-term care settings. The model proved that excellence in professional care could coexist with and even strengthen family bonds when approached thoughtfully. David's transition into social work brought additional insights to the field, particularly regarding the unique challenges faced by adult children who had provided care for many years. His first-hand experience of the identity reconstruction required after long-term caregiving ended informed new approaches to supporting bereaved caregivers. The children of long-term caregivers, he discovered, often needed specialized support to process their complex feelings about their parents' sacrifices and to develop healthy approaches to their own future caregiving responsibilities. David developed workshops for these families, helping them understand that honoring their parents' sacrifices didn't require repeating identical patterns of self-denial. Elvis's continued involvement in promoting awareness about family caregiving issues brought national attention to the need for better support systems. His advocacy helped secure funding for research, respite care programs, and professional training initiatives that improved outcomes for countless families facing similar challenges. The friendship between Elvis and David, which had begun with a chance encounter, evolved into a collaborative relationship focused on improving resources for family caregivers. They worked together on fundraising events, awareness campaigns, and policy advocacy that resulted in meaningful changes to how society supports families dealing with long-term care needs. Years later, when historians and biographers examined Elvis's charitable work and social impact, David and Eleanor's story was consistently cited as one of the most significant examples of his ability to recognize and respond to individual human needs in ways that created lasting positive change. The annual Eleanor Patterson Award for Excellence in Family-Centered Care became one of the most prestigious recognitions in the field of geriatric services. Recipients were honored not just for their professional expertise, but for their ability to support family relationships while providing excellent care. David's children grew up with an understanding of caregiving as both a privilege and a responsibility that should be approached with wisdom, balance, and support. They learned from their grandmother's story that love sometimes requires difficult decisions, and that the most caring thing you can do for someone might be to encourage their independence rather than their dependence. As they entered adulthood, both Eleanor Marie and Thomas carried forward their family's commitment to caring for others, but with a more sophisticated understanding of how to maintain their own well-being while serving others. They represented a new generation of caregivers who had learned from their parents' and grandparents' experiences about the importance of sustainable approaches to helping others. The story of David, Eleanor, and Elvis continued to resonate with new generations of families facing caregiving decisions, proving that the lessons they had learned together transcended the specific circumstances of their situation and offered guidance for anyone struggling to balance love, duty, and personal fulfillment in their relationships with aging parents or other family members who needed support.